Hello everyone, welcome to what we like to call in the business a lose-lose situation, where I'm going to be turning a critical, discerning eye towards a long-anticipated, crowd-funded sequel to a beloved shmup series that hasn't seen a release in the past 10 years, made by a studio that doesn't have any significant experience with making shmups before. What could go wrong? Seriously though, ever since I saw this game's demo, I've been dreading doing this review because, as experience has taught me, these types of releases tend to put me in a real nasty catch-22 because there's a lot of people who really want to like the game, there's a lot of people who will like the game, there's a lot of people who have put in money to invest in this game, and so when you come out and you give a not so favorable review, you find yourself in a kind of nasty trap where on one hand, there's going to be a small section of people who may appreciate your honesty, or at least appreciate you being honest about your own perspective, and they'll say thanks and kind of move on with their day, and that's that. But on the other hand, you're going to have a very vocal group of people who do like the game, or they do want to justify certain aspects of the game, and they will fight you tooth and nail. And so, while I do think it is my duty to be honest and to be straightforward and to try my best to pinpoint why I don't think this game is worth a recommendation, at least from myself, I do just want to say that I take no pleasure in this process and I do sort of dread doing these reviews. So in the future, if you could just make sure that every shmup that comes out is really good, I think we all could avoid this problem. And so R-Type Final 2, let's begin by thinking about this game's development history a little bit, because I do think that is relevant. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, the first thing that I did was looked up this studio and looked up what have they done before this release, because one thing that I do find tiresome, and I think a lot of people can agree with this, is when they do these franchise sequels or these franchise reboots, whatever you want to call them, it is rarely ever done by the actual studio who created the original game. So while ReRim may sign off on it or may be involved in the publishing in some way, they're not the actual boots on ground people that are creating the game. They're not as hands-on as we'd like them to be. Granted, probably the people who made R-Type and the R-Type games these days, those came out in the 80s, they're probably either retired or dead, so I do understand there being a second studio involved. So in any case, I guess you get what you pay for, and that's kind of, I think, the overall view that I take on R-Type Final 2. I think it is an honest attempt. I don't blame this developer as someone who's being disrespectful to the franchise or anything like that, not like a DMC type situation. But on the other hand, I just don't think the studio was ready for a challenge like this, and it really shows in a lot of ways. So let's just begin by talking about the overall visual presentation, because that's the first thing that struck me. And I actually thought this would be my main crux of this review before I started playing the game, because even from the footage that I saw in the demo and footage that I saw in release videos, I wasn't really a fan of the visual style. I might have talked about this a little bit earlier, but I do not tend to like visual styles like this where, yes, the resolution is nice, and it is technically an upgrade over what we have received in the past, like R-Type Final 1, or the R-Type series in the arcade, R-Type Leo, all that sort of stuff. I tend to find that these types of releases lack the art direction, lack the polish, and lack the visual attractiveness to really justify that being the sole reason for their existence. So the idea being, let's make a new R-Type game, let's upgrade the graphics. But they sort of upgrade the graphics with this type of presentation where it seems really generic. It seems like this could be from another franchise. It always makes me think of StarCraft 2 graphics. It's like, oh, this could be something from StarCraft 2, and that's a game that's very old. It's almost as old as R-Type Final 1. So that type of visual presentation I'm not that big of a fan of. That being said, I don't think the game is terribly ugly. We're not in King of Fighters 15 territory or anything like that. But there are some issues with the visuals, even beyond just them looking a little bit stale, a little bit unpolished, unfinished. They just look, again, like they were copy and pasted from some generic model maker or something like that. The big issue that I have with a lot of the visuals of the game is that in a gameplay sense, they are not very clear. There's a lot of things that are just missing in the visual design as far as the gameplay. For example, there's a lot of enemies that do sudden attacks, attacks that will fill the screen, attacks that will cover a large area, or the attacks that are very fast. Typically, these types of attacks in shmups tend to be very heavily telegraphed so that amid all the chaos of what you're doing, you're able to see the attack coming and then dodge it. In the case of R-Type Final 2, I think they were way too subtle on the visual indications of some of these things, where it just seems like all of a sudden, here's a giant laser, especially the first time you play the stages. This happens quite a bit. Or a lot of things will sort of spawn and fire right as they're spawning on screen. I don't think that's necessarily that great game design either. And then there's stuff with the background and the textures where things in the background, it's unclear when they're in the foreground. This happens actually quite a bit with enemies, with really large enemies like enemy ships that are sort of in the background, and then you'll see in the footage here I fire on it because I think, oh, maybe it's active, but it's not. There's no strong visual indicator when it becomes active in the foreground. And also sometimes things in the background look like, hey, could this actually damage me? And they can't. Or there's times things in the foreground look like they're in the background, so you go to fly into it and you suddenly explode and die. This happens a lot with enemies, where those sort of come from the background and blend in with the foreground so heavily that you don't even know they exist and you just fly into them. These types of things, I think, visually are a big problem, and they should have figured out some sort of visual indicator to help people understand when something's in the background, when something's in the foreground. I'm not an expert in 3D design of how you could do this. Maybe some kind of flash, or maybe darken the background a little bit. Something to make it a little bit more clear, I think. Another problem with the visual design that I had is just the real blandness of the character models. Some of the models look pretty decent, but other ones look like boxes, or just boxes with wheels, boxes with cannons. I mean, it's very, very geometrical and not in a good way. Again, it feels like you went to the Unity shop or the Unreal store, I guess. I don't really know much about Unreal Engine, but you went to the asset section of Unreal Engine and you found square. You're like, aha, that's the enemy. And as someone who's not very talented at visual presentation, I can empathize with budgets and all that. But at the same time, it just doesn't give the game a grit. That's what it's missing. It feels too sleek. It feels too shiny. It feels like you're walking around with a brand new pair of white Nikes. Some people love that. Some people think, like myself, think it looks kind of strange to be wearing jeans, a shirt, and then a shiny pair of shoes. That's what it feels like to me. It just needs to be a little bit more lived in and worn in as far as the visual presentation. Another real problem with visual presentation gameplay wise is the bullet design. So the bullets look cool in some degree, but there's a weird transparency to a lot of them where it's kind of hard to track them from the background because they blend into the background way too much a lot of the time. And then also, they're not fully formed bullets sometimes. Like the sprite or whatever it is isn't all together, and so it becomes a little bit difficult to figure out where are the hitboxes on these things, and that becomes a big pain, especially since this retains the R-Type style of having a massive hitbox. So your hitbox, I don't know how big it is, but it feels like it's basically your whole ship. You don't have a lot of squeezing room, you don't have a lot of wiggle room as far as like you typically get in a bullet hell or something like that. I know that R-Type is known for having a big hitbox, but I think that would have been one nice innovation, one sort of bit of modern design they could have squeezed in there, is make that hitbox a little smaller, make it a little bit more generous. So then the last thing I want to talk about visually is the cohesiveness of the visual design, because it feels like there is no cohesive visual connection between any of the game. Whereas when you look at something like Ketsui, Dodonpachi, Battle Garega, Death Smile, old R-Type, R-Type Leo, all these games, they tend to have a cohesive visual design from stage to stage, so it feels like all the stages belong in the same environment, in the same game, in the same universe, even if there is a good amount of variation. In this game, it feels like from stage to stage, they're just levels from different games cobbled together. Oh, here's the space level, cyborgy portal looking level, here's the water level, here's the asteroid level. It just doesn't really cohesively come together in a lot of ways, and the enemies don't seem like they belong together. It just doesn't work as far as the cohesiveness of the visual design, I don't think. One other thing too that I definitely need to talk about is if you're playing this on the Nintendo Switch, don't. It doesn't run well. It has a lot of slowdown. It has frame drops. It feels, I guess, arcadey in that sense, but considering it is not supposed to run that way, that's not a good thing. It's like playing the Super Nintendo port of R-Type. Maybe that's like the idea, keep the Nintendo tradition going with the extra slowdown. But in any case, I definitely do not recommend playing this on the Nintendo Switch. Get it on probably the PC is your best bet. I don't know the PS4 performance, but PC is probably your best bet. And also, I got it on Switch for handheld mode, and also just to review the Switch version, because I think that would probably interest people the most. But in handheld mode, the game doesn't work all that well either. It also has slowdown, and things blend into each other a little bit too much on the handheld. It's hard to visually distinguish things. The bullets aren't really all that big, aren't really all that distinctive either. So playing on handheld, I don't think is all that great of an experience. And even if you drop the resolution down to 40p, that's a trick that you can do in some Switch shmups to get them to run more smoothly. It still has no effect. The game still runs choppy and badly. And this is after downloading that 2 gig update patch. So I don't know if this is getting fixed anytime soon. I guess we'll see. But as of right now, I definitely would not recommend getting the Switch version for performance reasons alone, as well as I don't recommend the game overall. But with that being said, now let's get to talking about the gameplay, because I think this is going to be the main kicker, the main thing that people may or may not disagree with me on. So the thing about R-Type in general is that it isn't necessarily my preferred shmup series. I'm not that massive of an R-Type fan. My favorite R-Type game by far is R-Type Leo, and that is known for being very different from the rest of the series. But the thing about R-Type, even the older ones, is that despite them having this really slow, methodical pacing that's really setup heavy, where you need to know how to maneuver your ball and get things set up, you know, that's sort of the idea of the game design. And I did verify this by playing some old R-Type while I was working on this review. I think the big problem with this release is that the level design and the enemy formation design is very rudimentary, to where nothing flows into each other all that well, and it sort of can fall into some Euro shmup territory at times, where one of the biggest problems in shmups that you really want to avoid is just allowing the player to sit in the middle of the screen and fire, and that's a viable strategy. That comes up a lot in this game as fairly viable. You don't have to move around all that much in a lot of the stages. And also, there are these huge sort of empty zones between the waves. I don't think that's a good thing either. I don't think having a bunch of just downtime in between enemy waves, you really want to try and avoid that with shmups, because they are a replayable genre. You want to pack them. You want the gameplay to be dense and delicious. And in this release, I think it's way too spaced out. You're not really getting a whole lot of bang for your buck. If you go ahead and raise the difficulty, they do sort of fill in with more enemies, but also the enemies get more bullet spongy, and so that doesn't feel all that great either. So whatever mode you're playing in, I didn't have a whole lot of fun with the wave design. And also, there's a lot of issues, like I mentioned before, where things just act strangely, and they act like gotcha moments where things just come on screen and fire. And there's a real memorization element to this game, but not in a good way, because some of the things that you learn earlier in the stage are contradicted later on. I don't think that's ever a good idea. Like, I can't remember which stage it is, but there's a stage where it introduces this tank enemy. This tank enemy has a specific flight pattern, and it's very important to memorize this flight pattern, because it also fires these very fast, deadly shots. So when you first play the level, you're likely just going to get sniped in the face by this thing, but then you learn its flight pattern, and then through doing that, you're able to get through the rest of the stage. Then there's a second section of the stage where those tanks return. It looks exactly the same, except now its flight pattern is randomly shifted a little bit. So instead of coming down and firing and moving back up, it does this long dip and then fire. So it mixes up its movement. And typically, in my opinion, if you're going to change the movement of an enemy, you need to do something with the palette to distinguish it from the other one, because it feels like you're playing with constant uncertainty in this game. That is the real problem I found with the level design, is there's not a lot of logical sense behind what the enemies are going to do, what the weapons are going to do, how the bosses are going to act. For instance, there's this one boss where it just fires these beams and then rotates them. and there's no sort of warning, there's no sort of indication that this thing's gonna rotate. And so invariably, the very first time you fight this boss, I almost guarantee, unless you've watched replay footage or you're just a shaman of R-type design, you're gonna get hit by this because it's just gonna rotate randomly. And it's not even all that visually distinctive, the cannon. So the very first time I played, I luckily was sitting in between the cannons when they fired, but they just fired and I was like, oh, I guess there's cannons there. And then they rotated and killed me. And so once, the problem with this game design is that it's not all that complicated. And so experienced players will basically go through, get tricked 1 or 2 times, figure out the adjustments, and keep going. And then they'll look back and say, oh, I guess it kind of makes sense. But no, it doesn't make sense. And I don't think that's good level design, because that makes the first gameplay experience of this game not all that enjoyable. You just fly around and expect to die from section to section, not because it's overwhelmingly difficult or it's pinning you down or it's cloistering you and you can't find a way out. It's mostly just because it throws novel things at you that you've never seen before, or there's some weirdness with things popping from the back of the stage, or things just spawn and fire. I mean, that was my experience playing through this game, and I played it for 4 or 5 hours, and my way working through it was, okay, I just need to memorize every single section and I'll get sort of sniped out by different things. The boss fights in this game, I was not digging the boss fights. So the very first boss fight, I almost feels like one of the better ones, because it makes some sense, even though it's very, very simple and easy to take out. And so the second boss fight is this box that you fight, these 2 boxes. I'm guessing the idea is that you use your ball and damage the boxes that way. The game expects you to fight the bosses backwards a lot for some reason. Maybe that is an R-type thing that can happen in R-type, but I mean, it really emphasizes that. And the funny thing about it is the bosses have so much wait time between their phases, because the boxes are supposed to spawn and you're supposed to fire them and then they hide away and then they come back out. There's so much wait time between the waves of the boss movement, and the bosses have so much HP that you often just time out. Even if you're trying to play aggressively, you'll end up just timing out quite a bit. And then I figured out, oh, in pretty much all the boss fights, not all of them, but most of them, there's usually a really exploitable safe spot. There's a really exploitable part of the stage, and you can just sit there and time the bosses out. And I know what people may say, well, that's not a good idea because that may hurt your score or whatever it is, but in my opinion, you can't use score as a crutch for bad survival gameplay. I always feel that the first incentive is that you need to survive, and then the second incentive is then you need to score. But if you're able to basically just hang back and time out all the bosses for survival, and your only motivation to fight them and be aggressive is scoring, I think that is a problem. That is a problem with your boss design. And also, the boss designs themselves are extremely underwhelming. I looked at the first R-Type Final and it had this problem as well, but I guess that's the question. R-Type Final had a problem, so carrying that problem forward to R-Type Final 2, is that acceptable or not? I guess in some ways it is, because this is a newer studio and they're just trying their best to make a sequel, I suppose. But I still find it to be pretty underwhelming that your bosses, at least a lot of them, are like boxes or just sort of these polygonal things. I don't know what boss 3 is supposed to look like. It's like a metronome type thing. Real lack of creativity with the boss fights, or they're just not dynamic or engaging at all. It's like a chore. Every time you get to the boss, you're like, oh, okay, this is a chore. It's not fun. It's not exciting. It doesn't get the blood pumping at all. You get bored through the boss fight. That was, I think, the main problem that I had with this game. Is I've often fluctuated between boredom and frustration. And this is a channel that plays a lot of shmups. And while I did play the original R-Type and felt some frustration, it also was dynamic and engaging enough to keep you interested and keep you retrying the credits and stuff like that. In this game, I went ahead and I played it for 4 or so hours. I got pretty far in the game, and then I felt like, do I want to keep playing the game? I don't really feel the motivation. I don't really feel the drive to keep playing. There's nothing that's really holding me. There's no oomph to the game, right? And so I found that to be a problem. I guess the other thing to talk about real quick before we talk about the extras is the music. I wasn't a fan of the music either. Now, the later you get in the game, I'll admit the music does get better, but especially stage 2, it has this track that sounds like a very generic track that you see in like bad movie trailers that are supposed to be inspirational, or maybe it's like a commercial by Nike about how they're saving the world even though they have sweatshops in China. And it has this really inspirational music, and you're like, yeah, Nike, they are saving the world. Microsoft has these types of commercials too. That is the vibe of the music in stage, I think it's stage 2. Again, the later stages, the soundtrack does get a little bit better, but overall, I didn't find it a really exciting, engaging soundtrack. And shmups, I don't talk about it enough, but shmup soundtracks are really important, especially if the other elements are lacking. At least having a slammin' soundtrack could help. Or Sin Mora is like this, where the game really isn't all that good, but at least it has a fairly decent soundtrack. I think this game's soundtrack is very generic. Again, like the visuals, it felt like they went to one of those websites. It's like buysoundtrack.com, and they just bought cinematicsoundtrack.com. That's kind of how it felt as well. I wasn't that big of a fan of the soundtrack. Now, I'm not sure if R-Type is a series that's known for having a great soundtrack. I do think R-Type Leo has some bumping moments, and the original R-Type sounds pretty good. In any case, I didn't enjoy the music all that much. Let's end by talking about, I think is probably in a lot of people's minds, the main selling point of this thing, which is the extras. And I will admit it has a healthy amount of extras, and I do like this idea. So I like the idea of adding all these extras, like you can customize your ship color. I've always been saying you should allow people to do that. That does add a lot of fun to it. So I like the custom ship colors. I like this sort of F-Zero shop system. It reminded me a lot of F-Zero. I wonder if that's where they got their idea, where you can buy the decals, you can put the decals on your ship in all these different ways. I liked all of that. I think that was all really great. And then you had a bunch of unlockable ships. All that's perfectly fine. The problem is that you need a good game to use these ships in, or a solid base game to use them in. And again, this is where I think tastes is going to make this a little bit tricky, because when I do reviews and stuff, I do find people who sort of appreciate this style of game design. Like when I did the Euro Shmup episode, I did have people saying, yo, I actually like this sort of very slow, methodical, sort of situational, not very cohesive sort of game design. I actually like that. And so if that is what you like, I can't argue against you, because those are the issues I have with this game. I guess what I'm hoping to do with this review is my personal recommendation for the taste that I have, and if I guess you can watch more of my channel if you want to learn more about my tastes, is that I do not recommend this game. I personally wouldn't buy it, you know, outside of being a YouTuber and reviewing it. I personally wouldn't buy it, and I don't really see myself planning to play it all that much. Instead, what it did is it made me play it, and then I'd put it down and say, you know what, I need to play some R-Type Leo. That's what the game inspired me to do. So I guess in that regard, it brought some R-Type Leo into my mind, but I just cannot see it being a really true successor to the R-Type series, because there are a lot of games that I think if you're looking for an interesting successor to the R-Type series, I might recommend, like Blazing Star, Polestar. I think those are very heavily inspired by R-Type, or may have shared developers from R-Type. I know there's some kind of connection between them. A Blazing Star, for example, has the R-Type ship in it. But one last thing that I want to talk about in this review, the overall entertainment I find by reading other reviews about shmups, and I was mostly curious to see what other reviewers would say about this game, because I'm having a little bit of a fun experiment where I want to see how bad a shmup needs to be before mainstream game reviewers give it a bad rating, or, you know, they tend to cue in on what the problems in the game are. And when you read through these reviews, like for instance, I was hesitating whether or not to get the game, you know, it's a $40 game, and whether or not to review it. And so I thought, well, you know, if it's well reviewed, maybe I'll move on and avoid the catch-22, or maybe it'll be good and that'll be a good thing, and then I can review it without too much headache. But I went ahead and read some of the reviews that came out, and there were some pretty good ones. Like Will wrote a good one. He's done good stuff in the past. Tried to get him on the podcast before. But I read this one by Eurogamer, and I couldn't help but sort of laugh at it a little bit, and it seems a little bit mean. This is like a thing I'm picking up on with gaming journalism, is that if the reviewers don't really seem to care or really know all that much about the genre or about the game, what they will do is they'll sort of create this poetic, thematic review of the game rather than talking really specifically about what is good or bad in the game. Instead, they'll give this real literary, I went to college review. And so I thought, you know what? I've been doing this wrong all these years, spending hours researching the gameplay, comparing it to other ones in the past, researching the level design, researching the development history, checking into the scoring system. I didn't talk about the scoring system in this review because I feel like if you want me to talk about your scoring system, you need to make a good survival experience, because otherwise it feels kind of whatever to me. But anyway, I've been doing it wrong all this time because, you know, that's a lot of pain and headache and grinding out those stages and talking about the boss fights, all that stuff beneath the top echelon of gaming journalism. So I thought I need to step my game up, especially if I want to start working for publications like Eurogamer. And so I thought, why don't I end this by presenting my professional review of R-Type Final 2. R-Type Final 2 Review by Mark MSX. Subtitle: Prelude to the Ultimate Truth. R-Type Final 2 is a cosmic dance. It is a swirling cornucopia of plasma and metal that softly, gently tickle the eardrums of the intrepid cosmonaut. The game is an otherworldly echo of a bygone era, a solemn tribute that sings the comforting clatter of coins, lovingly tossed into the legends of the past. It is a game that teaches the cold pain of isolation and the burning pleasure of victory. R-Type Final 2 is a lie. It is a bold-faced contradiction. If R-Type Final 1 was created a decade ago, if it was the ultimate chapter, how can this sequel exist? This is false advertising, a betrayal to the deepest region of the heart. There can be no sequel to an end. I mean, besides Final Fantasy II and the other games like that. But I shall not digress. The catastrophe of life is two-dimensional. Are we all not merely spaceships, lost in a void of bullets and hitboxes? The genre of shoot-em-ups or shmups symbolizes the cycle of resurrection. With every credit, a new ship is born, to struggle painfully through the trials of death and debris, only to end in abject failure. Even the most dedicated, practiced, and dare I say, religious players must meet their own game over in the end. From R-Type Final 2, we learn that there is no meaning. There is only oblivion. What we see on screen in this game is unreal. It is actually literally unreal. Graphics are not meant to be looked at. They are meant to be understood. In the darkest psyche of the human mind, we question quality. We question value. We question expectation and promise. These are the wrong questions. Music is a kaleidoscope, a feverish mixture of bass and tenor. The strings of the soul keep rhythm to the beat of the spawning bullets. Heed not the cries of the enemies, but only the call of duty. Thank you for listening. So thank you to 72 PCT Water, Adam Pearson, Adrian Reyes, Ukshay Wadkar, Dingo, Andy Cap, Another Joe, Anthony A, Ben Wynn, Borgie22, Brian Reboot, Brian Shiver, Corio, Danielle Savage, Delta Tango 6, Disco Stas Leia, Dominic NG, Eric H, Full Set, Retro Shmupper, Geriatric Donmaku, Hausu, Ilya, Kiwi, JLab, JB RPG, Joe Angelo, Gameboy Guru, K, K2, Kikoman589, Larridge, Malaise, Mark Toms, Maz, Meher Calendrian, Minong, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Neon Dagger Games, Okla Kugels, Philip Mason, Portal 6-3, Raoul, Realskeen, Sketcher Raccoon, SLW, The Boot Rex, TRM, Sugumo, Yishi, Plasmo, and Utakaya. Thanks for watching.